All right, well, good morning, everyone. Today's topic is a look at Northern Europe and Spain in the 16th century. And I think one comment I want to make before I get going, I just want to say to everybody, as you look at the visuals in this presentation, I really hope you'll see the very, very different character of the artwork as compared to the character of Renaissance Italian artwork. There is such a different feeling outside of Italy about uh, religion, about superstition, about the past. It has such a different mood, and it's going to be a great contrast to what we're going to look at next week when we return to Italian art. Starting with a little bit of geography, I like to just make large points, not small points. But as you take a look at the map and you look at that kind of central ochre area, I want to remind you that in the period we're talking about, what we would now call Holland and parts of Switzerland, parts of Austria, Germany, were all included in a polity, a religious and political grouping that we call the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. And it really lasted in some form or another until the beginning of the 19th century, until 1806. But our presentation will mainly focus on art from the northern regions of this area. A little bit of a history lesson, just to bring you in with some context. You want to remember that this is a very powerful period for Catholic Spain. It was the dominant economic power in Europe by the end of the 16th century. And of course, our lecture is going to coincide or overlap with the age of Spanish colonization and the strength of the Great Armada. A big political development that will overlap with this lecture is the Protestant Reformation, and it split Europe, producing 100 years of war between Catholics and Protestants. This is also going to be the period where, as part of that split, Luther's 95 Theses appeared on the door of the church at Würzburg. And when you want to think about how strong the language and the posture of Martin Luther was, remember, he called the Pope the Antichrist at the time of the High German, Holy Roman Empire. So in this split, we're going to see a change in the artwork where Protestant artwork veers towards salvation and Catholic artwork maintains a very, very different character and a different relationship to the image of Christ. And we'll start out with Germanic art, with Northern art, and it is tremendously intense, filled with vibes of fantasy and imaginative dread, if you will. And this really is the last gasp of a kind of medieval imagination before Protestantism would change the artistic values. So we'll begin with Grünewald's Isenheim altarpiece. And there's so much to say about it, but I'm just going to be able to give you an introduction today in case you want to go to the internet and learn more. But the first thing I want to say about it is that it includes 3 layers or levels. And I want to go forward and show you how that works. If you were to see it today in Germany, the image that we just looked at, the fully open version, is displayed in front. And then behind it, some interior panels, and behind that, some lindenwood carvings. And I'm going to go through all of these so you can get a glimpse of them and begin to understand what this great crucifixion is about and what makes it so distinctive. But I'll start with a close-up of the crucifixion and tell you that this painting was made for an Antonite monastery. In other words, a monastery dedicated to St. Anthony. And the monks of that monastery were specialists in treating skin diseases. And maybe that accounts for the incredibly macabre treatment of the body of Christ. I don't know that there's anything like this in other Renaissance art, or especially in Italian art. You really can feel, I don't know how else to say it, but you feel the body as meat, and you feel how it's been violated by thorns, by being dragged down the road. You really feel the rictus of rigor mortis setting in. It is such a violent and explicit fantasy about the human body. And when you look at the details of, look at the nails of the crucifixion, they're like railroad spikes. and look at the congealed blood, maybe what you'd call fungus infections under the toes, a gnarled hand. I mean, these kinds of expressive details, I think they were really of interest to Expressionist painters later, German Expressionists, and also to Picasso when he made Guernica, because the violence, the compressed violence, and again, detailed explicit violence of Grünewald was unmatched for centuries. Some more details. We have a rather, almost a masculine Mary Magdalene holding the Virgin, who clasps her hands in the base of the crucifixion while closing her eyes as tears come down. One thing I've heard said about Grünewald's painting, I heard somebody refer to it as a moonscape. And when you look at that very, very deep black background, that is very, very striking. It seems to be almost a midnight occurrence. On the other side of the crucifixion is St. John, along with a Latin phrase, which when you translate it, he must increase, but I must decrease. And a historical note, St. John had already been killed when Christ was crucified, so he is a symbolic presence in this crucifixion, and probably chosen by Grünewald because he was the last prophet who announced the coming of the Messiah. So that's only, a glimpse of some of the front panels. What happens when we open and go in? We get this radiant scene with almost I call it a nuclear or an electric palette, glowing reds and oranges, rose colors you'd rarely see in paintings of this period. And there are some details, there's some iconography that's extraordinary. So as Mary holds the infant Christ in front of a kind of a revelatory skyscape, is what I would call it. One of the great iconographic details, there is a chamber pot in the scene. In other words, what you'd find in a toilet, and it's to indicate that Christ is human in this painting. That's an icon of Christ's humanity. And surrounding all of this, there's a kind of a celestial concert. And you might be interested to know that in medieval hospitals, they often practiced music therapy. So maybe that is a medieval hospital scene with angels playing that's been brought into this. And the resurrected Christ, who leaps from the tomb and tosses off a white gown, appears in front of what has been interpreted as either the face of God or the eye of God. And you can see that his presence is blinding. He doesn't have a circular halo like you might have seen in an Italian or a Byzantine painting, but it's as if his presence radiates into something greater and joins the atmosphere. So dramatic, but we have another level to go. In the third wing, we have a kind of a great series of carvings by a different artist. So that tradition, Northern tradition, is brought into the painting. And it includes St. Augustine. And the second name there, Guy Guers, is the patron who paid for the carving of this section. So he kneels in tiny form over there at the left. But Christ and 12 apostles are down below, all carved in lindenwood. And then in the panels, we have a visit of St. Anthony to St. Paul the Hermit. And I think most dramatically, we have St. Anthony tormented by demons. And I want to go in close and show you those demons. And tell me afterwards in the chat, tell me if there isn't something almost contemporary or illustrational about the variety of these ghouls and demons. And I know I couldn't help making a comparison when I put this together this morning of thinking that must be where the wild things are, came from, that kind of imagination. Another classic work of Germanic art from 1510, a famous print, The Witch's Sabbath by Boldung Green. And you might be interested to know, if you're a little bit surprised to see witches in a German painting, that in the 16th century, there was tremendous interest in witchcraft in Germany. And that's why the publication of a book about witchcraft at the end of the 15th century was reprinted 14 times before 1520. And you want to remember that these were, very, very early printed books. So yes, the Gutenberg Bible was popular, but so was this book about witchcraft. And you can see them, they are sort of making a potion together. And up above, there is a naked witch riding on a goat, which think would be a symbol of Satan. And in her fork there is this kind of unguent or potion that's being created. This is an image that I think in one woodcut, it tells you what began to happen with the Protestant Revolution, how that affected religious imagery, how it changed the way people felt about religion in art. So in this woodcut of 1530, after Martin Luther came along and posted his protests, you see an allegory of law and grace. And I want you to start by looking on the left side of the tree. Take a moment and look left. In the left side, you can see that Christ is like a Byzantine king. He rides dominantly on a kind of a globe that floats above all of this. So we have a very distant Christ. And in the foreground, we have a running Adam running out of paradise, literally followed by a skeleton with a spear. And Moses is trying to make a point by showing the 10 Commandments in the corner. Adam and Eve are in the background. And I think what it tells you, to use a little bit of humor, is that the Catholic view of the world involves always having a spear at your ass because of sin, and distant Christ can't really help you. Whereas in the Protestant view on the right, you see that Christ actually stands with the same man, and the revelation that comes in the form of the Holy Spirit from the crucified body of Christ is on the way to provide salvation. And we even have another image of Christ on the right where he, kind of comes out of the tomb and he stomps on a dragon as if to control that monster of the medieval past. So you can see this is a bit of propaganda from 1530. I mean, based on this, would you choose to be a Catholic? Would you choose to be a Protestant? I would say that Protestantism looks much better, although you're still naked in this chronic woodcut. A little more history and context. Albrecht Dürer, whom many call the Leonardo of Germany, Germany's greatest early Renaissance artist, traveled widely in Europe and was really one of the first artists to gain an international reputation, probably because of his printmaking and because of his travels. He was a synthesizer who began to put together the style of Northern European art, which included, as you know, intricate detail and realistic objects, all of that, began to put them together with Italian stylistic features. He was the first artist to keep a thorough record of his life, including a number of self-portraits that I think later were very important to Rembrandt. And he's a very, very important graphic artist, well known for his engravings. So when you look at Dürer's third self-portrait, painted in the year 1500, when he just before his 29th birthday, you see a very, very solemn frontal portrait. And that kind of frontal portrait was very, very rare in secular portraiture. It was usually used for and here we go, the imagery of Christ. And so you can see there's a Memling image of Christ from a few years before. It's almost as if Dürer gave himself a kind of a Christ-like countenance in his own self-portrait. So great confidence in that. But this has that northern feeling of intense detail. And detail was something he was a master of, even in his notebooks and his watercolors. Some of the things that he did in rather small format and in watercolor are on par with the greatest, images of nature from naturalists like Abaddon. I mean, incredible what he could find in a piece of turf with reflected water and plants that botanists could identify plant by plant. Extraordinary variety and detail brought together in his singular mind. So looking at this, if you look at the Adam and Eve that he engraved in 1504, I know that the question I found myself thinking about when I was making today's lecture is I thought, had he seen the Sistine Chapel? Had he seen what Michelangelo had done with the human body? And the answer is probably not, because he made his first trip to Italy in the 1490s, and then he went back again after this, where he may have seen work by Michelangelo. But in that first trip, he was in Venice. And that's where he got his ideas about the human figure drawn Italian style. That's where he got the influence of humanism and that's where he got the classical proportion. But he really made a Germanic Adam and Eve, complete with the oak leaves for modesty rather than the Italian grape leaves. And you can see the wonderful detail of the serpent crawling over the branch from the German forest to gnaw at the apple. And down in the foreground, a cat, a mouse, a rabbit, a stag. You know, he took, that's what I mean by saying he took the Italian style and synthesized it into Northern art. And because this was a multiple, because this was an engraving, these were sold all over Europe. And Dürer's wife is considered one of the first great international art dealers. She really helped him make a fortune with prints like this. So there's by the way, from the Sistine Chapel, there's Michelangelo's Adam and Eve, and that is about at least 5, 6, 7 years later than Dürer. A famous etching that has a kind of a bravery and morality as its topic, Night, Death, and the Devil, where you see the Christian knight, riding forward. Some wonderful details in this one. If you look at the plaque on the lower left, looks like a charcuterie board with no cheese. There is the AD. He was one of the first artists to have a monogram. So that appears in all of his prints. And again, wonderful, wonderful details and characters in this. You can see kind of a great medieval horned monster behind him. You can see the devil holding an hourglass, letting him know that his time on earth is finite. You can see his loyal dog riding next to him. You know, these are the kind of things about Dürer's prints that entertained people. The more they looked, the more they saw in these tremendously detailed engravings. And finally, in the Four Apostles, in an oil painting a little bit later in his career, I think you're now beginning to see some Protestant influence. And you see it in a couple of things. Mainly, you see that the apostles are now not so much seen as prophets or miraculous figures, but they are seen as scholars who are holding and discussing and studying books. So that's a very, very different kind of characteristic for those apostles. And they're also painted in a style that looks a little bit Venetian to me, with a bold red robe for one apostle, lime green for the other, chiaroscuro lighting, tremendous details down in the sandals where they stand, you know, believably, and they have contrapposto under those gowns. So again, you see the evolution of German art in Dürer. And I want to give you one kind of weird anecdote about Dürer, but it'll put this in context. I'm sure you've heard that during World War II, the Nazis were stealing art from all over Europe. And one of Hitler's visions was to have an incredible a museum of German art on par with what the Louvre is. And when he's putting this together, somebody, I think it was Hermann Goering, asked him about, what Dürer paintings did he want for the museum? And Hitler did not want Dürer, which, that would be like saying, let's have a museum of Italian art with no Leonardo da Vinci. But Hitler's reason for this was that Italy had, Italianized and ruined Dürer's art, in his view. Such a feeling of imaginative fantasy in Germanic art. Look at this battle of Isis with, thousands and thousands of figures, a battle between the Germans and the Turks. And you get this kind of, what would you call it now? A drone's eye view, very, very far pulled back. So you see this all the way across a water-filled landscape in the background, and then a la Monty Python, you have a giant flying signboard with what could be animated pieces of cloth that serve as wings and a tassel coming down, as if you could yank it a little bit lower if you needed, announcing, the story and the title of this painting. Incredible, incredible piece of painting. In Hans Holbein, you get an interest now in science. And when he painted the two French ambassadors in 1533, he had this idea of maybe showing two opposing views of the world, one more about science and one more above culture. So everything that's on the upper level there, on the woven rug, are their instruments, including an astrolabe, a globe, navigational instruments. They all relate to the science of stars and astronomy and navigation. Whereas down below, you have a lute and you have books and you have also some pipes. So you have a whole different set of devices. And you also see how differently the two ambassadors are dressed. One holds a telescope and the other is a cleric, in a simpler garment. And among the details that make this painting so interesting, there is what you would call an anamorphic image in the painting. And if you go back, do you see that weird kind of fleeting shadow between the men's feet? If you take that, and I tried to tweak it in Photoshop a little bit, but if you change it in perspective, it is a human skull. And so there is this interest in optics and in distortion, which goes along with the long-term German interest in lenses and that era of science. So he threw in a special effect to mesmerize us. Shifting quickly to France, in the mid-16th century, France waged a campaign against the Spanish king, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor. At the same time, Francis I was very, very enamored of Italian culture and worked to enrich French culture. In fact, one of the things he did, besides using all kinds of French architects and artists when he built, he brought Leonardo da Vinci to France for 3 years, and that's where Leonardo da Vinci died after working for Francis I. So there's a picture of Francis I, and when you take a look at it, you get a feeling for what I'm going to call the provincial quality of French painting. And what I mean by provincial, there's an incredible interest in the garment and the jewelry, showing off kind of the wealth and aristocracy of Francis and making it all kind of gleam and harden. But when you look at the face of the king, you can see that Renaissance naturalism is not quite happening. He has that fantastic nose that almost seems flattened, as if it was maybe partly in profile or three-quarter view. And then behind that, you have a tapestry. So it is both a highly detailed and slightly distorted image of the king, still executed in tempera with oil on top. This is one of the projects that Francis was working on when Leonardo da Vinci came to France. It was begun in 1519, and it's a mishmash of architectural styles because if you look at it, you can see it has rounded turrets, which might remind you of a medieval castle, but it also has 3 levels, which look like they might have been taken from Italian architecture, from Florentine architecture. But at the roofline, you see all these little towers and turrets. And by the way, you can walk as a tourist. You can go up on the roof of a Chambord, and you feel like you're in a sort of a forest of medieval buildings. So it's a group of different architectural styles brought together outside. And then on the inside, that is the last bit of architecture that Leonardo devised, a double helix staircase that takes you up between the levels. Tremendous architectural developments were happening in France as well. And here we can see that the Louvre Palais, which had begun as a fortress, maybe in the 11th or 12th century, continued to be built up and expanded. Kind of a great horizontal skyscraper is one way to think of it. And in the center of it, the center of this particular area, the architect Lescaut devised a square courtyard and a square room above it. And that later became the most famous room really in the Louvre Palace, the Salon Carré, this kind of fantastic square gallery. And for generations after the French Revolution, this became where you would start your experience of the French salon exhibits in this fantastic kind of setting. You might want to know that the Louvre was not public until after the French Revolution. We really don't get what you call a public art museum at the Louvre until the king has departed. So earlier, this is where you would have seen royal collections when you were a guest of the king. In the Netherlands, remember that during the 16th century, the Netherlands was controlled by Spain. And in that region, the work of Hieronymus Bosch, which stands out for all kinds of reasons prior to the Reformation, it really took the religious imagination to a kind of extreme. And in a moment, when we see the images, I'll tell you what I think that came from. Later in the 16th century, you have this first kind of revolt or split that came on, and Arras in the south remained Catholic, and Utrecht in the north became Protestant. And that is the germ, if you will, of modern day Holland and Belgium, with, of course, the Dutch Republic appearing later. It was a very prosperous area due to trade, and that is partly what brought the growing diversity in styles and subjects. Later, it's going to be in Holland that you get the first commercial art galleries where a ship captain might, trade or buy works of art and take them somewhere else in Europe. All right, when you take a look at the great Bosch triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, this is what you would see when the panels are closed. And that depicts the world during creation, maybe the third day of creation. And you see plant life, but no animals or humans yet in this kind of watery globe. But when it opens, it is absolutely full of life. And the imagery of the three panels starts with a vision of paradise on the left. And don't worry, I have some details for you. Paradise on the left, the garden itself in the center, and then the vision of the Last Judgment and hell on the right. So let's go in for some details, because details are where the delight really is. On the left panel, God is presenting Eve to Adam. And when I say God, God is manifested by Christ. And on the right, you can begin to see some of the imagery of hell that seems so strange and so dreamlike. One theory that people have often put out about Bosch is that he lived in a time where rye bread might be going bad. You get something called ergo poisoning, and there's been a theory that maybe that gave people the equivalent of an acid trip. I think that's also been discounted. And I tell people that Salvador Dali did not use drugs when he made his surrealist paintings. So however it worked, Bosch had access to a kind of a very, very deep, dreamlike, imaginative experience. Here in a detail of the left-hand panel, we have pre-incarnate Christ blessing Eve. And you can see in the foreground all the kind of wild reptiles and birds and even amphibians coming out of a circular pool, with a wonderful detail of what looks to me like a desert plant on the left. By the way, each region of Bosch's painting has a foreground with water in the middle and then a skyscape at the top. Here's a detail of what would you call it? An S-shaped murmuration, a flight of birds through a kind of a sculpted tower, where the images of the tower itself almost seem organic or fleshy. The complete center panel, so densely populated. And to try and interpret this, I want to keep it very, very simple, but I'll just give you a few thoughts, and then you can go back on the internet and look at it more closely. But I think the two thoughts are that in this period of time, this doesn't seem maybe as strange as we find it, because in medieval preaching and in sermons in the literature, there were very, very powerful and literal and detailed images of the punishment of hell. The kind of things that you see here, flowers growing out of an anus, people floating in a globe with animals, cross sections of huge floating chambers and rocks. I mean, you might have heard these kinds of things in the sermon of someone trying to scare you. So I think the second comment that I want to make is we really see the epitome of a certain type of early Christianity in these images, but just laid out with an unprecedented level of detail. It's a world of travel. It's an interracial world, which I think is very, very interesting. It's a world of fantasy skyscrapers that are partly organic and partly somehow alive. It's a world full of piercings, things that go through each other. It's a world of terror and wonder and sexuality. Maybe matter-of-fact sexuality is one of the things that's surprising about it. Some more details where you can see the scale of the giant animals and the small human beings. Maybe that's saying that, in the garden, that humans and animals had a different sense of priority, that they really were, more like each other, or had more shared experience. That notion of picking the apple as sin, repeated here multiple times. And what does the strawberry mean? And what does the owl mean? I mean, you tell me, because I like to use the expression that paintings don't usually come with an instruction manual. So it seems like many of these things are invented. I have read that the cherry can be a symbol of pride. So when you see a woman here contemplating what seems to be a cherry, maybe that's a firm bit of iconography. Look at that combination. Look at the I don't know what to call it. This giant strawberry with a scorpion tail and butterfly wings on the shoulders of one figure. Extraordinary. There's some more cherries. A woman with a peacock on her head offers a cherry to three women bathing together. Is that a parody of the three graces? I mean, you tell me. It's interesting to see Bosch close up to realize that although we think of him as a very, very detailed painter, seen close up, he was a painter whose brushstrokes were visible. They do have a sketchy quality. And has there ever been a more terrifying or credible image of hell? Here, a prince of hell, eats the body of a sinner through his bird-like head, wearing a bronze crown, and then, what else can I say? Shits them down into the sewer of hell. So quite a punishment. And as this happens, we see another sinner vomiting with fear as a man holds his head above this pit. And we have to use our imagination to imagine what's in the pit. There must be a hellish music playing, because over on the left, where you see instruments including a drum and a man playing a flute through his ass, there is another figure holding his hands over his ears from having to listen. A hollowed out body representing the Antichrist, and it's inhabited by gamblers and other dissolutes, planted into the ground. And a wonderful kind of surrealist image on the upper left, a knife blade between two ears. Leaving that world and going back to something that's, a little more reassuring. This painting, which is about 6 feet tall, was the first northern painting, the first, I'll call it Dutch painting, that showed a heroic couple, a heroic, they should be an Adam and Eve, but he's called them Neptune and Amphitrite, so he's made them ocean gods. But you can see how the influence of Michelangelo and the idea of the classical heroic body is now making its way north. And a weird bit of iconography here. I'm going to have to read up and find out, why are there steer heads with golden horns in this temple? I'm really not sure, but worth pointing out at least. There are also some wonderful paintings of secular life that appear in the north. And this one, the way, when I say secular painting, the religious culture in this period is so strong that even when you show what might be a business transaction, it has a little bit of a religious vibe. So here in Massey's painting, The Money Changer and His Wife, we see a man checking gold coins, checking them for their weight, maybe checking them for their alloy. He's weighing and balancing them. But as he does it, his wife has been reading the Bible, and the pages are open to an image of the Virgin, and the scales are often an image of justice, including heavenly justice in paintings of this era. So is he measuring something moral? Is he making a moral judgment? Or is he simply helping, change currency and making a financial transaction? And you also might notice the wonderful detail of the convex mirror resting between them, where you look out the window of their store and you see that configuration of stained glass in their window that looks quite a bit like a crucifix. And it goes on and on. A glass rosary hanging behind his left shoulder, and then a chalice for communion wafers in the lower left corner. Some pearls. Pearls are often symbols of the Virgin because of their perfection. So again, it's a secular painting, but full of all kinds of moral and religious suggestions. This is an absolute favorite painting of mine. And to make us all feel it, to talk about it a little bit, the butcher stall from 1551. I want you to imagine that for people of this era, this was a symbol of incredible, what do you say, celebration and prosperity. It's almost like every kind of food you could imagine. And of course, meat was for carnival. It was for festival days. It was a real treat. So sausages, pig's head, chickens, blood puddings, half a side of beef. So on the one hand, you're confronted with all the meat coming out of the abattoir. Can you see the butcher shop there on the upper right where the slaughtering is happening, and then there's a full carcass hanging? Anyways, you're presented with this kind of feast-like exuberance, all painted in a realist style. And you know what counterpoints with it is you go in the background and you see the Virgin with a swaddled infant Christ, and she is giving alms. She's giving what looks like a piece of bread to a beggar. So it actually is a rather moralistic painting because it says in a world of plenty and in a world of prosperity, don't forget to be generous. There's a little hidden moral sting in the painting. And I had to put this in there because it just made me think of it. I thought, are there contemporary paintings like this? It made me think of Wayne Thiebaud, because I thought when we want to contemplate a painting that's full of plenty, that makes us hungry, that makes us feel like we've got a sense of sweetness and prosperity, we have something very different in contemporary culture. Interestingly, there are maybe more women painters emerging in the North, in the Protestant North especially, than in Italy. Here's Katharina van Hemsen with a very, very businesslike self-portrait. She's got that tiny palette hanging from her thumb, smaller than the French palette, and then a wonderful device in her hand, that dowel that she's got on the picture frame, that's called a maul stick. And a maul stick allows you to steady your hand and work in fine detail and make a straight line if you need to. But you can see her tremendous pride as a creator of images, kind of a pride in craftsmanship, and she looks at you almost as directly as Dürer. Or another woman artist, Lavinia Teerlink, was a Germanic artist who painted Elizabeth I. And like the earlier portrait we saw of Francis, nobility is emphasized by the clothing. I mean, look at that fantastic depiction of her sleeves, of the jeweled belt, of her brooch with 3 massive pearls, of a crown of pearls. But maybe to give all of this a kind of a different side of the monarch, there's also a book open to the left. And when you know the history of Renaissance painting, you know that the Virgin is always shown reading a book. And maybe there's that, a hint of that, a hint of the religiosity of Elizabeth by having the book there on the left. Painted in front of parted drapery, gives you kind of a triangle that mirrors the triangle of her sleeves. Fantastically stable in the way it's composed. Landscapes are still relatively rare in art, especially what you'd call a standalone landscape that's just there for the sake of being beautiful or expansive. Landscapes appeared much earlier in Asian art, where it was a more defined subject. But here is a rare early landscape by Patronage of St. Jerome. And this one encapsulates that story where St. Jerome pulls a thorn from a lion's paw, and then the lion becomes his friend. So it has this little moral kind of statement of, the way to make friends with your enemy is to relieve their pain. And you can see that he's been far from the city, meditating in this little shed, and that he has a crucifix and a skull there on the right side of the cave. So I guess you can call this a landscape, but it's a landscape that helps frame a saint and a story in the foreground. But look how far it goes, all the way to the bluish reflected water vista. It's like something you'd see in Leonardo's Mona Lisa, that idea of the far distance in atmospheric perspective. Bruegel, you probably know the Bruegels were a whole family of painters, and their specialty were paintings that showed daily life, but also with a kind of a moralistic tinge often. And this one, the Netherlandish Proverbs, actually has about 100 tiny little stories, and each tiny little story is to remind you of a bit of wisdom or of a proverb. And I'll give you a few examples. So I don't know if you knew this before, but if you wrap someone in a blue cloak, that's a way of saying you are deceiving them. And you can see that this blue cloak even has kind of a, what would you call it, a brim, a giant duckbill. It will keep him from seeing behind him as to what this woman in red is doing. So don't trust her with the blue cloak. The pillar biter is a hypocrite. And we also have a woman here. If you look at the woman with tongs, she has fire in one hand and water in the other. So basically, don't trust her. You don't know whether she's going to set something on fire or pretend to put something out. You know, we don't know which is going to happen, but don't trust someone that has those two extremes when they come toward you. And this one, at first I thought this was gossip, but then I looked it up. Spinning one's thread from other men's wool, that's actually an image of the power of cooperation, doing a task together. So you want to remember, with all the paintings of this era, there was far less literacy. So often, you know, stories were told just through pictures. And in a way, this is like a children's picture book. You could spend, you know, hours in front of this painting parsing all of the different proverbs and relating them to the Bible and teaching and delighting people and making them laugh and telling stories. A wonderful painting that's one of Four Seasons by Peter Bruegel, the elder, Hunters in the Snow. And these paintings are so precious because they give us the details of real life. And here the pond is frozen in winter. So everyone is out skating as the hunters come back from the hunt. And there on the left, you can see the blacksmith working iron outside at the shop. You look, you know, again, across that whole vista and see the town and the steeple of the church. Looking at Spain, Spain, of course, was very powerful, gaining power after the mid-15th century. And in architecture, one of the developments in Spain is called plateresque. And the background of that is that plater or plate is a reference to silver. And so silversmithing, which made elaborate decorations and details, made its way into applications in architecture. So when you see the plateresque of Spanish architecture, it refers to detail. And I'll show you in a moment. It's an intricate decorative style that, among other things, shows a connection between Islamic art and Spanish art, because, of course, the Moors occupied Spain for quite a period. So at this very, very early college, the College of St. Gregory in Valladolid, you can see this plateresque entrance with a coat of arms above it. And I went on Wikipedia and found you a more detailed image. And look at what's happening there. You have cherubs and tiny figures in a tree that surround those two lions. And the lions look a little bit Asian to me. For some reason, I don't think they'd seen real lions in Spain. So it looks like Chinese or Japanese lions. But look at these details. You have the head of an eagle up above the coat of arms. You have men holding torches on each side, maybe the light of education, but all of it interweaves and becomes even more intricate up above their heads. And what a counterpoint. So imagine you're looking at this grand plateresque detail as you enter. You come on the inside and you see something much more organized. It's still plateresque up in the arches, but in the interior patio, completed the same year that Columbus made his famous voyage to the West Indies that turned out to be, you know, America. You would have been in this serene, protected courtyard, almost feeling like you were in a building that had been built in Italy. Maybe the greatest piece of architecture from this period was commissioned by Philip II, the very intellectual but also morbid king of Spain for a number of years. Here's a painting of how the Escorial originally looked, with a severe white exterior and then black roofs. But you can see it's how it's built into a whole series of formal courtyards. So it's both a fortress, and a library and many other things. It's been a monastery, it's been a burial place, it's been a library, it's been a hospital. And I found some photos for you. But first of all, let's mention Philip II. I think he really did for Spain what Julius II did for Italy. He was the first powerful humanist figure that took an interest in literature and culture and began to bring the Renaissance into Spain. And you'll notice he's painted by a woman portrait artist, by Sofonisba Anguissola, by an Italian artist in this picture. It's been said that during his reign, it was the beginning of a golden age that created a lasting legacy. And I just want to say personally, when you look at Philip and when you look at his outfit, I haven't checked this story for a while, but I remember hearing that his wife died fairly early in his reign, and you always would wear the color of mourning. You would wear black when you were in a period of grief, and maybe for months or for a year. He apparently kept on the black, for the rest of his reign. So his court dressed in black to also express grief, and it's almost the beginning of black as a very, very somber, grieving fashion statement, going back to the court of Philip II. And today, the way you would visit, light reflecting on the roof, and you can see the kind of spires in the interior. Fantastic hedges in the form of a maze. And the library at the Escorial, in 1576, it had about 4,500 volumes, which, by our standards, I wonder how many books there are in a Barnes and Noble in a typical inventory, 100,000. But you want to remember, this is a period when there were manuscripts, so handwritten ancient codices and books and records, and also some print books, probably from Germany. So to have 4,500 volumes at this point in time was extraordinary. And you can see also Italian-style murals going through the arches. Our last painting for the day, a painting that really didn't get appreciated till the 20th century. It had been neglected, and since then it's been heavily studied. A great oil on canvas, and just that is a breakthrough. So in other words, it's painted in the style that the Venetians had pioneered, working on a very, very large format, 16 feet tall, 12 feet wide, the burial of Count Orgaz. And in the lower section, you can really read that group portrait there as a kind of an homage, where El Greco, and you know what I'm going to do? I've had my coffee. I'll try and pronouncing his name. His real name was Domenikos Diatakopoulos. How'd I do? But, calling him the Greek was much easier. El Greco paid aristocracy to the clergy, to the jurists, to the poets, to the scholars. He put everybody of importance in there, paying homage to the Count in his gilded armor, who is about to be raised up to heaven. We even have St. Francis there on the left, looking on as this takes place. And then the upper section is very, very different. The upper section is the heavenly part that contrasts with the earthly part of the painting. And the clouds have parted as they would only do to receive a righteous man. And Christ in white is there at the center in this kind of clothy cloudscape. And if you're wondering, where is Count Orgaz? Where is he in the picture? If you see an angel there, a winged angel with his elbow folded, that is the spirit of the Count, if you will, his kind of ghost or his supernatural presence being funneled up into, heaven. And by the way, there on the left, if you're wondering, is this a Catholic picture? There is St. Peter, the first Pope, holding the keys to Rome on the left, making sure that this soul makes its way to the right heaven. So incredible drama, movement, and fantasy. There tends to be some distortion in El Greco. And I know I like these kind of sidebar theories, but there used to be an optometrist in New York who would do a slideshow about El Greco where he claimed that El Greco had an astigmatism And if you change the lens on the slide projector to adjust for that, you'd get figures that look more properly proportioned. You'd get more classical figures. And I don't know how credible that was, but part of the excitement, I think, of El Greco is the way that the figures are a little bit long-limbed and off and twisted. But it's also about a kind of a religious fervor.